Well, hello again. In the previous video we talked about the change in social norm and how the fear of social identity and the fear of categorization were plopped down into the stone of the public conscience 50 years ago. And now there are implications in the mass culture for that, and one of these most important implications for us is that people now have redefined their attitude to negative comments, and they see negative comments as intrusive, as something that is internalized and then changes your life success, influences your behavior in a very negative way. So now we are going to talk about more specific ideas, how what is seen as inappropriate in the 21st century classroom, and then let me pass over to my presentation. So we are going to talk about 3 things, but of course there are many more, and this is going to occupy about 20 minutes. So the first thing which we see as inappropriate now is called harassment. Then there is hate speech, and also very often in more conservative societies and less economically successful societies like ours, gender roles are promoted by the older generations, are seen as intrusive by the younger generations. So again, I remind you that this is a rule, but there are exceptions. So maybe you are the more progressive person who is who adheres to higher standards, which are promoted by more economically successful societies where there is this expensive practice of paying attention to these things, and maybe your students may come from more conservative families and they're going to react negatively to your more productive, more progressive norm. But generally the education system is much more conservative than the students, the youth that take part in it on the side of the clients. So why is it natural for teachers to struggle with these concepts? And it's not only about teachers, it's politicians, any people in power, right? But teachers are part of this process because we are you are the everyday power in the life of the younger generation. You are the king or the queen of your classroom, and you dictate the rules there. And very often children and their parents would see that as power, right? So first of all, why is it natural to struggle with this concept? Stereotypes are an essential part of economy of rationality. So we know that stereotypes now is mostly used with the negative connotation. The word stereotypes is negative very often, but actually this is a mechanism which helps us not to make rational decisions in all situations. For example, if you are a teacher and then there is an extreme critical situation where, for example, children in your class are misbehaving, and then it leads to disproportional aggressiveness in the classroom, and then you have the method you have the cheap rational decision to scream at the children, but then your identity, your professional identity of a teacher tells you that screaming at children is unprofessional, and as a result you are going to keep down that logical emotion and embrace the professional behavior. So in this case, this is not rational, this is the identity, and then also you have stereotypes, what children should behave like, what parents should behave like, what teachers should behave like, and they allow you to make fast decisions without logically thinking for 20 minutes what you should do in this situation. So stereotypes are a natural part of our mind, and the only problem with them is that very often they again adhere to the previous social norm, which we already don't share rationally. Then we remember that it is conventional for education systems to be more resistant to social change, so they are filled with more conservative people of older age who are generally being shaped up by previous systems. this is why most teachers have been shaped up by the systems that were not built on respect and equality. So we often tend to see negative experience, like when somebody told something bad to us, as character building moments. And I know that this is a very powerful mechanism, because even well, I have observed it in myself for a long time, and we only have one subject of study fully for psychology ourselves. So we often see negative experience as character building moments, because now we are the person who we are, and we remember that we had this negative experience, and we believe that we would not be who we are without this negative experience. At the same time, if you try to imagine that your life has been free of negative experience, imagine that nobody ever told you that women should not be scientists, or that nobody told you that math is not your thing, or nobody told you that you are a poor person from a provincial town and what do you want, then maybe your life would have become better, and maybe you would have been a person with less struggle inside, right? So we don't know, and we should not see negative experience as character building moments anymore, because they are our character building moments, but other people don't have to have these moments. Then unfortunately, very often there are many people who grew up in the paternalist and traditional framework, where age is an achievement, and where experience is an achievement, and then people can do a lot of work during their youth, but then just rest on the bed of roses which they earned. So many people who grew up in that framework, when they were young, they were dominated and suppressed by their older colleagues, and now they are the older colleagues, and they see their age as their turn to dominate and demand respect without justification. This is the phrase which might seem arguable, and I'm fully aware of that. I apologize if it seems arguable to you, but very often you would meet people who say that you need to respect me just because I'm like 60 or I'm 30 or I'm 40, it doesn't matter. So unfortunately this doesn't work that way anymore, because people with more experience are now not considered more valuable as teachers and people who promote the society's ideas. So you see, less experience, which is negative, probably is going to give you more motivation to do something, and this is why many modern youth would see this survival through a lot of negative experience as the reason to empathize with you, sympathize with you maybe, but not as a reason that you can tell something worthy. So people, because that scientific stone of the social identity approach has been plopped into the society and the mass culture 50 years ago, you now have this traditional idea in the society that experience should be successful, right? And if people have successful experience, then they can teach and they have the right to promote their views. But if people have unsuccessful experience, they need to justify why they want to tell you something. And I know this is tricky, so this is how it works, and we're not obliged to like it, right? It's not probably a very optimistic thing for people who have earned a lot of experience during their young age and they didn't like it very much. So then the three types of behavior which are seen as negative behavior. First of all, that's harassment. And I don't speak about sexual harassment. I hope that everybody understands what it is. We usually in our classrooms we don't really see a lot of sexual harassment. I hope so, because well, teachers are generally more responsible people than the general population. But harassment covers also a wide range of behaviors of an offensive nature, and it is commonly understood as behavior that demeans, humiliates, or embarrasses a person. So it's also characteristically unreasonable socially. It destroys the productive atmosphere. So if there is a teacher who humiliates students publicly, you probably understand that these students are going to be marginalized by this teacher, and then they are not going to get everything they needed from the lesson. So harassment actually hinders the learning process, and because the younger generation has a wider concept of harassment, we sometimes do not notice that our speech can influence this atmosphere. So I believe it is important to know what is harassment and keep from harassment, because it's also unproductive. It touches the strings in the people's heart which we did not plan to touch, right? In the legal sense, these are behaviors that appear to be disturbing, upsetting, or threatening. So you basically make a person uncomfortable for no good reason, because it's counterproductive to what you're trying to achieve. And if these behaviors become repetitive, if the teacher, for example, picks on the same student for many times, then it is defined as bullying. And bullying, we normally know it in terms of children to children, like, you know, on the same level of education and age. And we don't normally think that bullying can happen between parents and teachers, parents and parents, teachers and children, but it can happen in any form, right? So bullying is a big problem on all levels of education system. Then the key components of harassment. What constitutes harassment? How do we recognize harassment? So these are phrases, words, sentences which are unwelcome or uninvited. So for example, it's a joke which you find funny, but for the child it's not funny, and the child would not invite this joke to happen. There are situations, for example, when dark humor is completely appropriate and children engage in that and are readily accepting of that dark humor of the teacher. But at the same time, if there are children who do not like dark humor, they are going to be hurt by dark humor, and then if this behavior uninvited, this is harassment, right? Also, harassment is not necessarily personal, right? It targets characteristics that people cannot change. Like if you tell the person that they need to, for example, have a shower in the morning before going to school, it's not quite harassment if it is also polite, right? If you tell the person that this person is a migrant and that's why they need to learn that they need to take a shower, that's harassment for sure, right? This is a very negative statement that also addresses the characteristic that the child cannot change. Usually these characteristics would include age, gender, race, ethnicity, disability, belief, and orientation, with belief being a little arguable because, people can change beliefs to a certain degree, but they are very unlikely to do that under pressure, right? So then a person who cannot change these characteristics and is attacked with reference to these characteristics will suffer an identity crisis. And in the 21st century, when the mass culture deals with the idea that negative statements should not be negative, then these characteristics will change. These negative attributes are going to diminish the child, right? So also the harassment will create a degrading, hostile, humiliated environment. Therefore, it will ruin the teacher-student relationship and hinder learning, right? So examples of verbal harassment will include threats, like here, I will refuse to teach you class, and no other teacher will take you, nothing good will come of you. Here the person will address the characteristic which is like mind capability, right? Then shouting and aggression, here generalization, silly girls like you and so on, and then sarcasm. Here is our world-class genius arguing again. All these things are examples of verbal harassment. They should not happen in the classroom because they disrupt the atmosphere. The second Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. So another implication of harassment is that harassment often involves the public humiliation. Harassment will take a person, put the focus of the public attention on that person, and then diminish the person due to the characteristic the person cannot change. There is typically a high degree of agreement among students on which teachers engage in harassment. So I know it seems like it's not very clear which behavior is harassment and which is not, but if you ask students and then they have the set of experiences from different teachers, they're going to say that this teacher is a harasser and that teacher is not. Harassment happens in the classroom, so students witness the behavior and other teachers don't, which is a big problem. And another problem of Russian schools specifically, but it's true about all schools in the world also, is that schools don't have a mechanism of protecting students against harassment. Say firing the teacher. That's why it means that if somebody complains, the conflict will run until it disrupts the process completely, and this is a problem. If there were a mechanism how to protect students against harassment, then less cases would get to that extreme level where the teacher should be fired because the conflict has come so far that it's now a legal issue. So also the next type of negative statements is hate speech. Hate speech is any kind of communication that attacks or uses pejorative or discriminatory language with reference to a person or a group on the basis of who they are. So hate speech is not attacking a student personally, right? Hate speech is attacking a group of people who cannot protect themselves because of their age, gender, race, and so on and so forth. So examples of hate speech could be like this. People with tattoos are more likely to end up in prison. Even if nobody in the class if nobody in the class has tattoos, and you say that phrase about some far outside people, then you are still going to get a negative reaction that will disrupt the atmosphere. Because it's not that the students see that you are true, that you tell the truth. The students will see that you are a hateful person, and they will treat your words and your other words like that. Then this is an example I heard myself at a museum, and Bulgakov was a drug addict, a weak-willed person with an immoral lifestyle, 3 wives and so on. So this is attacking Bulgakov, of course, but it's also attacking drug addicts, because drug addicts are now seen as people who are sick, not as weak-willed people who are immoral, right? So this is again a very impolite phrase to say about a group of people who can't protect themselves and answer you, and it is hate speech. This is why. Another example from a Russian school, but not in Novosibirsk, it is a Ukrainian textbook, and they never have any concept of scientific truth. This is a generalization which is not justified, right? And it is very hateful, and again it diminishes the group of people who can't protect themselves, and then as a result the children who hear this statement, they are going to distrust the teacher. They're not going to distrust Ukrainians, they're going to distrust the teacher as a result. Then a Krasnoyarsk statement in a classroom. People from Novosibirsk have no taste, just look at their architecture. Like, you can see it has a sense of truth in it, there is a grain of truth in it, but at the same time this is generalizing and hurting people who can't protect themselves at the same time. And then my personal pain, complaints about how modern children are terrible, right? Modern children have no memory, they know nothing, and at the same time in your classroom there is that child who always answers all questions, reads books and so on, and then this child feels hurt because you antagonize the whole group and you generalize the statement so that children who are not part of who you are angry with still feel diminished and negative. Another large part of gender roles in a classroom are now a big problem too, and there is this set of rules which good English textbooks use so that you can keep from hurting children and disrupting the learning atmosphere. So there are several rules. So the first rule is that nouns of common gender are used with academic or publicist pronouns. So for example, if you have a CEO, Chief Executive Officer, that's a position of power, and very often teachers others will say every CEO is responsible for the public image of his company, but you should remember that the CEO can be her, right? So his or her company is better. If you use generalizations in a textbook, you would need to use the plural, like working parents need more childcare options and more paid leave, and not working mothers, because it's not only mothers who need childcare option. Fathers are also part of the family, right? Part of the team. Also, there is this slide which you can read yourself, so both men and women in exercises should be equal, right? You should not have examples which associate that men travel, achieve economic success, and lead interesting lives, and then women do domestic chores, take part in breeding children, and also they can't achieve success. So this is now bad taste. Children are going to pay attention to these sentences like my mother cooked dinner and so on, and my father traveled around the world. Children are going to be diminished by them, and they're going to feel negative about the textbook, which is also very disruptive. Then, if there are fiction examples, of course, the previous centuries are still very important. We still have the same culture, right? It is a continuous process. But if you have a culture with the gender roles from the previous periods, and then you have an example, like here from Stephen Leacock's story, mother was rarely able to have a treat like that, you always need to indicate when the sentence was written, because when children see that it was written in 1929, they're going to have the standard, they're going to invoke the standard that says it's a historic attitude, not the modern attitude, not how it should be, not the way it should be now. Then, if you have historic figures mentioned in the exercises and the texts are quoting some public figures, then you need to embrace both men's and women's cultural experience. For example, if I have an exercise in my textbook about articles with personal names, I'm going to mention Mozart and I'm going to mention Marie Curie. And I'm going to try to keep some equality about how many men and women I mention, because children are going to notice that. So, in conclusion, I'd like to show you two quotes about how old his ancient philosophers complained about the younger generation, so that you feel like you are not alone in that complaint. So here is a quote from a Japanese philosopher, so it is the 14th century, early 14th century, and here he complains of how modern people use worse language. They don't speak in full words, they use not quite slang, but they use simpler phrases. So instead of raise the carriage shaft, they say raise it, or trim the lamp wick, trim it, right? So then this language complaint is old, right? It is 8 years old. Another famous quote is about well, the phrase which is attributed to Socrates, but it is actually a retelling of Plato. So Socrates may not directly have said that. It's the quote of the 19th century, of the 1908 phrase from a textbook which retells Socrates, right? Quotes Socrates. So you see how older people would complain about younger people, that children begin to be tyrants, not the slaves. They don't rise from their seats when an elder enters the room. They contradict their parents. They chatter before company. And then also, the funniest thing for me about that is that the ancient philosopher complained of children being able to look clever merely reading books, like reading the Iliad from the parchment, not learning the text by heart. So what we see as an achievement now, that children read books, it's like a good thing, right? Many centuries ago it was seen as a degrading experience, because you see, children don't learn by heart, they just read, and this is like the easy way out. So it is very natural for the education system to complain of the children who don't do the things the way we got used to, and maybe the change in social norm is going to bring this contradiction down a little bit, because the world is becoming a little bit more balanced, because the competition in social norm usually leads you to more balanced, not unbalanced situations. So at this optimistic note, I would like to finish our story. So thank you for your attention, and see you next year.